When you clicked on this video just now, you were motivated by something. It could have been curiosity, could have been that you wanted to learn something, but there was an underlying motivation there. And in fact, everything you do all day long has an underlying motivation, most of which are unconscious. In this video, we're going to take a look at motivation to learn by looking at the largest meta-analytic study that's ever been undertaken in the history of educational research, spanning 42 years and 1,300 studies. And from that, we're going to extract the core beliefs and traits that underlie motivation to learn. Now, in terms of beliefs, remember that beliefs are things that can change on a dime. You could acquire new information or have an insight that completely changes your beliefs forever. However, personality traits tend to be more fixed over the lifespan. They can change, but they tend to change very slowly over time. They don't just change on a dime. So we're going to take a look at beliefs and traits that most strongly correlate with a motivation to learn. And along the way, we're going to look at a little bit of statistics. Okay, so let's take a look at the construct of motivation with regard to learning experience design. There are many, many ways of looking at motivation, but when we're talking about learning experiences, the types of motivation that we're interested in is two types. One is the motivation to learn. This is your intrinsic motivation, whether or not you are actually interested in the subject matter, you're fascinated by the subject, so you want to learn it. The other is motivation to transfer. Motivation to transfer is your desire to learn something so that you can go and solve a problem in the real world or do something in the real world based on what you've just learned. So if somebody goes on YouTube and they're looking for how to fix a sink or something like that, then they've already got an issue in the real world. They want to solve that. That's motivation to transfer. They're motivated to learn because they have an idea that they want to apply it. Whereas motivation to learn itself is really just interest in the subject matter from an intrinsic point of view. So those are the two different ways of looking at motivation that we're interested in. And motivation to transfer is really more likely what you want to measure within organizations in terms of learning experiences. Now, another way that we can look at the construct of motivation is to do a meta-analysis. This is where we look back over a whole bunch of research papers, ideally every significant research paper that we can find on a given subject, and take all of those research findings and compile them all together into a grand summary of all of the research that's ever been done. This gets us a little closer to the truth of the matter or the construct than anything else that we have in terms of research. So when we're looking at the construct of motivation to learn, there are two different research studies that were done that did all of this for us. So the first one was created in the year 2000. Jason Colquitt, Jeffrey LePine from the University of Florida, and Raymond Noe from Ohio State got together and looked at everything from the year 2000 to the previous 20 years. Every single study that they could find, compiled all that information together and created what was the first construct model of motivation to learn. Then later, Raymond Noe actually went on with Chung and his colleagues from Hong Kong Polytechnic and did the same thing right up to the year 2022. And they took it even further. They looked at now 42 years of research studies, compiled all of that together, and put together a model of motivation to learn divided into antecedents and outcomes, and it's a beautiful diagram. And we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive and take a little bit closer look at what's in this diagram, what's actually going on here. So when we look at the left side of the diagram, we're seeing the antecedents to motivation to learn, the things that lead up to it or contribute to it, you could say. And then for the most part over on the right there, we have all of the outcomes from motivation to learn. Now, these are all connected by lines and arrows, and each one of the lines has two numbers on it. And the first thing is the correlation coefficient. So this is based on their meta-analysis of all the studies that they looked at. This is how strongly correlated those two things are. Now, a correlation of 1 means they correlate perfectly. As one changes, the other one changes proportionately in a perfectly straight line. That's a correlation of 1. And then as one increases, the other decreases is a negative correlation. So if you have a negative correlation, or a positive correlation. Either they both go up together, that's positive, or as one goes up, the other one goes down, that's a negative correlation. So that's the first number that we're seeing there, are the correlation coefficients. And then the second number in brackets is what's called the standard error. Now, when you're doing a meta-analysis and you're looking at a whole bunch of studies and you're taking all that data and combining it together, you can imagine in each and every study, you typically have some kind of bell curve that results in a standard distribution of the data in each and every study. And if you take a whole bunch of standard deviations and you get the mean of all those standard deviations, that's called the standard error. And the process of doing this tends to pull you even closer to a mean value, which is why you see that most of these standard error values are very, very close to one another. It's because they've looked at a lot of studies. So the more data you look at, the closer you get to things narrowing in on an actual measure. So they looked at 1,362 studies. That's quite a few studies. So let's take a closer look at what's inside here. Now, if we look at the antecedents, the contributing factors, the ones that I think are really significant and pop out here are the number one is self-efficacy. This is the belief in your own ability to learn. Now, let's just stop there and ask ourselves, if this is the number one factor, self-efficacy, the belief in your ability to learn is the number one determining factor in motivation to learn, then we should take this pretty seriously. And what can we do about this as learning experience designers? Well, one of the things we can do is measure it. So if you suspect that low self-efficacy, that people just don't believe they can learn this stuff, then that is something worth measuring. It's worth doing a survey and not only measuring their degree of self-efficacy, but also find out why. Ask them why. Do you believe you can learn this? And if not, why? And it could be that you find out that there's a problem with the course material, or the course that they've presented is just confusing, or it's too high level. They need something a little bit more basic, or something that's more suited to their needs. So there's a lot of things that we can do in terms of low self-efficacy. The first thing to do, though, is measure it. See if it's actually really happening, and then you can do something about it. Now, the second thing, if we look at the construct of motivation, the second most important factor is organizational commitment. This is your sense of duty and responsibility to the organization. Now, if you have a high sense of duty and responsibility, you're going to be more highly motivated to learn. But if not, this can be influenced by other factors, and we're going to do a whole other video on this whole idea, but just at a high level, commitment to the organization is influenced by a sense of belonging and belief that the organization is committed to you. So if you believe that the organization is committed to your welfare and well-being and cares about you, you're more likely to be committed to that organization. And one of the things that comes up a lot, if you look at the research on this, comes down to justice. We're going to do a whole video on this later, but if you feel that you're being treated fairly and others are treated fairly, you'll have a much higher level of organizational commitment. So again, this is something you can measure within an organization. We're going to take a deep dive on that, but that's another factor here. And the third most important factor is job involvement. And what this is really referring to is how critical are you in your work? If you were to disappear suddenly, would the organization really be hit hard and miss you a lot? Or is your role more of like a cog in a machine, sort of a frontline worker type who, if you were to disappear, they could replace you immediately? You're not really that involved. So the higher your level of job involvement, the higher your level of motivation. And essentially, I would say that this is actually tied to a sense of purpose, that if you have a greater sense of purpose, you're going to be more highly motivated. So one of the things that you can do in order to ensure that people actually have a sense of purpose is to make sure, and this is especially true for frontline employees, people who are on the front lines dealing with customers or doing the ground level work in the organization, it's very important to let them know when they do something right. It's all too often the case that organizations focus almost exclusively on when people make mistakes and correcting those mistakes and doing regular meetings where you go over job performance and that type of thing. And it's just important, if not more important, that you recognize wins, that you recognize when someone's doing something right and highlight that, especially if you can let them know that what you're doing matters, that we care about you, and also show them in real concrete terms how what they do matters. You can show people the actual impact of their work. So you should be able to, for any frontline employee, measure and show them, look, you're making a difference in the way that the organization is operating in some sense. Those are all different ways that you can enhance that So these are not like fixed traits within an organization, but they are things that we can look at in organizational dynamics that are big factors when it comes to motivation, and they are all things that we're going to do a deeper dive on. Now, another aspect of this, aside from the organization, are the personality factors that are related to motivation to learn. And the three big ones on here, there's actually generally 5 factors. They're often called the big 5 personality factors that are measured when we look at personality constructs. And of these 5, the 3 that are most important are openness to new experiences. So this personality trait is that basically you're open to having a new experience. You're someone who, if I say, hey, let's try doing something and it's something you've never done before, you're like, right on, I love doing new things. That would be a high degree of openness to new experience. Whereas if you're the kind of person that if I tell you, hey, let's try something new and you've never done it before, you're going to be not interested in doing something. I don't like to do things that way. I like to do it the old way. I like to do it the way I've always done it, that kind of thing. That kind of thinking is a low openness to new experience. So that's the number 1 factor in terms of motivation contributor to motivation to learn. The second one is agreeableness. Agreeableness is just really your willingness to go along with things, to go with the flow, to not put up resistance when things are not quite going your way. You can roll with the punches, that kind of thing. So that's the second factor. The third factor is conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is really just a sense of doing a good job for the sake of doing a good job, that you take pride in your work, that you like doing things right, doing things the right way. That is conscientiousness. So these 3 personality factors are all positively correlated with motivation to learn. The other 2 personality factors that are part of the big 5 are extroversion, which is on a scale from extroversion to introversion. So how much of an introvert or an extrovert are you? And this has almost no relation. It's very slightly, extroversion is very slightly negatively correlated with motivation to learn, but it's only slight. So basically we could say that if you're an introvert, you're maybe slightly more likely to have a motivation to learn, but it really doesn't have much of an effect. And then the final factor, the least important factor you could say, is that neuroticism is ever so slightly positively correlated. And you can think of neuroticism as just emotional instability. The more neurotic someone is from this psychological construct perspective, the more volatile or emotionally unstable a person is. That when things don't go their way, do they fly off the handle or do they just accept them? And this is different than agreeableness, the willingness to kind of go along with things. Neuroticism is a general emotional reactivity that's distinct from agreeableness. But again, this is only very slightly correlated with motivation to learn. So if someone is just a little bit neurotic, perhaps we could say, or if they have a neuroticism, that it's going to have maybe a slight effect, and this might just be related to someone being more agitated, being more driven than normal. That might show up as neuroticism on a personality test. So those are the personality factors. Now, personality factors in general, when we look at personality factors, they can change a little bit over the lifespan, but the whole idea behind a personality factor is that, in psychology at least, we like to say that generally personality factors tend to track pretty consistently across the lifespan. And when you look at research studies that have been done over the course of people's lives, when they measure their personality factors when they're young and then when they're older, you see that things really haven't changed very much. So personality factors can change over the course of a person's life, but they are much more stable over the course of a person's life. So from a learning experience design perspective, we can keep in mind that openness to new experiences, agreeableness, and conscientiousness are ideal qualities in a learner, you might say, but that personality doesn't really matter too much because we can't change it. We know that where there's going to be learners with all kinds of personalities that are going to be experiencing the learning experiences that we're creating. So there's really not a lot we can do about that. There's going to be a range of personality factors, but it's good to be aware of the personality factors that you might have to work with when you're doing training and how these can manifest in the real world. So that's a little bit of a deep dive on the construct of motivation. And the next series of videos that follow this one, we're going to go into deeper aspects of motivation in a whole bunch of different ways. So that was motivation to learn. Now, considering the fact that we've broken this down into beliefs and traits remain relatively stable throughout the lifespan, but beliefs can change on a dime. And we focused on 3 core beliefs that contribute most strongly. That is a person's self-efficacy, their belief that they can learn, their organizational commitment, their belief in the organization, and the fact that the organization cares about them and they care about the organization. And third, their belief in how important they are, or their level of job involvement in the organization. These things can change very easily because beliefs can change. And remember that you can measure beliefs through surveys. So if you can determine where the beliefs are at in an organization, you can shift those beliefs, or you can take a look at the factors that contribute to someone's belief and change them within the organization to shift everyone toward a greater motivation to learn.